I think archaeology and antiquarianism before archaeology are part of a wider understanding of human mind, the fact that a culture do not exist without some idea about the past. But these ideas are considerably different from one period to another period, from one country to another. And if we look at the state of the present, with all the destruction connected with war, and also the international destruction of some monument by the ISIS, we are facing a problematic which is very old. Because in some way, the control of the past is an insurance for the control of the present and the future. If you look at the practice of antiquarianism in Sumerian, Assyrian societies, first, for the Akkadian, the concept of the future is behind you, and the concept of the past is in front of you. So it means that you cannot be a reasonable person without some knowledge about the past. And this is a question which is profoundly present in culture and civilization. One of these dimensions is a relationship between the traces of the past. I mean the ruins. Ruins has different acception in different countries. But to take an example, at the moment in which all the Greeks were facing the Persian army on the invasion of Greece, a group of cities decided to unify, and this decision was taken at Plataea, and this is the War of Plataea. And in the regulation, which were voted by all the Greek cities which were part of the Confederation, one decision was made that the Greeks decided never to reconstruct the temple which were burned by the Persians as a sign of their impiety. But if you have the experience of the Second World War, and this is not my direct experience, but the experience from my parents and professors, when the German division Das Reich destructed the small village Oradour-sur-Glane in the south of France, they decided, some of the people who were still living decided to maintain the village in the same state as it was. So can you imagine, you are in the 50s, at the end of the 40s of the previous century, and people behave like the Greek at Plataea. And this is, for me, a kind of sign of the universality. And universality is connected with diplomacy, because only a kind of responsibility of a country to another country can produce a good diplomatic relation. So, we know that a lot of diplomats were engaged in the protection of antiquity, and I know that Italian diplomats tried to prevent the destruction of the Buddha of Bamiyan, and it's failed because some fighting in the ISIS itself. The fact that some of these people look to eradicate any form of the past. But if we look at the history of Islamic culture, we found in the beginning of the 9th century, so centuries after Muhammad, that people in childhood were reflecting about the pyramids, because some of the the Islamic ruler, wished to destroy the pyramid. And these were the engagement of the Sultan to destroy the pyramid was a failure. And a famous antiquarian and doctor explained that the idea to destroy the pyramid is a barbaric idea, that the pyramids are there as a testimony of the past and a tool for reflecting about the past and the future. I think in the agenda of a comparative sociology of the past was set up by the Durkheimian school. So after the First World War, Durkheim, before the war, was involved with his strongest collaborators, Marcel Mauss, to reflect about a comparative history of civilization. And Louis Gernet, an Hellenist, was part of the team. And when Jean-Pierre Werner, who was born in Furtin, came to the Sorbonne, he had this relation, he had attended the lecture by Marcel Mauss. And when at this time, Werner was a student, after he was professor of philosophy at the gymnasium in Toulouse, and he engaged in the resistance with another friend of Marcel Mauss, the psychologist Ignaz Meyerson, doctor of medicine and psychologist. And they were the two main commanders of the resistance in Toulouse. And Toulouse was a unique city in France which was liberated by the resistance. And at this moment, Vernon was nominated colonel in the French army and sent to the German occupation forces in South Germany. And he spent some time there as an inspector. When he came to the general-in-chief, he said that he was struck by the fact that the behavior of the French occupation forces against the German civil population were rude, were inefficient, and he decided to resign his position in the army. I have to say that he was a communist, and so very few people from the resistance were at this time accepted in the army, but Vernon was selected for that at a moment in which de Gaulle tried to pacify the resistance. But Vernon declined, and he went back to his teaching as philosophy in the gymnasium in which I was educated. Jacques Decour was a professor of German who was the head of the resistance, and he was massacred by the Germans. And Vernon decided to follow Meyerson and Mauss, but his agenda was a kind of, he began his research reflecting about the figuration of the gods and the religion of the Greek. And this was the departure of this long journey in which Vernon, Détienne, Vidal-Naquet, Nicole Leroux, and other people joined the team. And I was lucky enough when I began my study at the Sorbonne in the first part of the 60s to attend the lectures of these people who had a clear agenda of trying to develop the anthropological dimension of ancient society. And Vernon created this group, le Centre de recherche comparée sur les sociétés anciennes, the Center for Comparative Studies in Ancient Societies. And this was the point of departure of the journal. The actual agenda is not so easy because I think that the success of the so-called Paris School was like the success of the Annales School in history. That at some moment you can look at most of the teaching of Greek and Latin in various universities in Europe and outside. Anthropology is the core. So the originality with the diffusion of this idea of the so-called Paris School is no more evident. So we have to find new way to look at the past, and we have to face the terrible pressure of the harassment of the knowledge of Latin and Greek. And this was precisely in 1964, Louis Gernet, who was retired from the École des Hautes Études, was elected president with an honorific charge of the Elite Society in Paris. And I can remember at the end of his lecture he said, look, we are heirs of the classics, but in some, Gernet said, I have no idea, but in 50 or 40 years, Greek will be also rare like Sanskrit. So no, Greek will be reserved to a small specialist group of people interested in the preservation of the past. And we, as Hellenists, have to fight against. And I have to say that we try to fight against, but the problem is still more under question. The fact that the young people are also in some university, can you imagine that in France, the University of Rennes abolished the teaching of Latin and Greek. So we can speak about some victories of culture. We can also speak about severe defeat, which are creating a kind of gap between our tradition and the tradition of the future. So the 68 revolt in France, the French student uprising. This is the title of the book we published, Pierre Vidal-Naquin and I, at the beginning of '69, as a kind of collection of tracts, manifestos, and documents about the student uprising. This uprising was connected with a large vision of international relations, because we were in contact, students who were involved, we were in contact with Rudi Dutschke in Germany. We had some contact with the people from Berkeley who had organized a massive sitting in Berkeley. And at the beginning, the movement was absolutely not planned. So the 3rd of May, we were some students, in general left wing, from the communist, anarchist, and other. We were having a meeting at the Sorbonne, and the rector of the Sorbonne decided to close the faculty. And we were taken from the police for inspection at the Commissariat de l'Opéra. And in the process, but the police decided that only the male student should be sent to the commissariat. So all the women were liberated. And this group of women went in the Quartier Latin saying, we are arresting our camarades. And the beginning of the movement was this spontaneous reaction, because we were not used at the idea that the police will enter the Sorbonne for nothing. It was only a meeting with 400 people. And the government asked the police to go further, and this was the beginning of a movement which was connected with an immense frustration. immense frustration because at this time the regime, the De Gaulle regime, changed profoundly the structure of economy in France, investing in research, investing in collective housing and so on. But university was not in the shade scale. So when people of my generation arrived to university, the structure was an old one with a strong relation between the poverty of the resources and the bad administration of libraries, of special courses. In some cases, you could not enter in the aula because too much people were enrolled. So the university was in a moment of change, and the government and the elite of the professor had never tended to change the processes. And this explains the beginning of the movement. This was the first stadium. The second was the fact that unexpectedly the worker joined the movement. Also, the country, the land was completely blocked. And this opened also way for the future, because after when the movement in May, at the end of beginning of June, the movement was exhausted, and De Gaulle and Pompidou had the idea to ask an intelligent politician, a professor of law, Edgar Faure, to patronize a reform of university. The first decision was to create 5 or 6 new universities in the center of Paris, to develop university outside, and this was a movement which opened for people of my generation several possibilities: scholarship, teaching position, and clearly when we entered very young the staff of university department, we were interested in reflecting on the anthropological approach which had been developed by Germain, Vernon, and the others. So you have this connection, which is more a cultural connection than a political. The idea was that we had a tradition, and the French classical tradition was very connected with, I would say, with positive history, with a kind of historicism which was not in the expectation of my generation.